Well, Sue, thank you so much for joining us today. As we start, can you maybe say a few words about your background, your some of the most recent roles, and also how did you get into cybersecurity?
Thanks, Misha. I appreciate you having me today. I have had a long and great career, starting out in tech, always have been in tech my entire career, coming up through the ranks. And I spent 12 years as a CIO. And as a CIO, you always have security in your shop. At some point, several years ago, decided that I wanted to make a switch into security because it was getting hot in the field. I had done so many CRM and ERP implementations that, security was really something that was new and exciting, even though I had had it, for many, many years. And then I made the switch, became pure play CISO about 8 years ago, which makes me extremely experienced in this field. So that's kind of how it all happened. Um, and happy to be here as a female CISO and a very small number of us in the industry.
Certainly, certainly. Well, as someone who lived through SAP implementation in a global 30,000 person company, I can certainly appreciate the experience. It's almost like everything is so fluid and flexible, but then it's like pouring concrete. It's fluid and flexible up to the point when you actually set in motion, and then every change request is it's very painful, and it's also painful kind of adjusting your organization to software. I guess it's a separate conversation, but I think your experience is unique for a number of reasons, and specifically that you sat on both chairs, being the CIO and CISO. And I know a lot of those themes are kind of shifting and evolving, and they're kind of different school of thoughts in terms of who CISO should report to. Is it kind of a standalone C-level executive reporting to the CEO and the board, or is this something? Is this position needs to be reporting to CIO? I know there is no kind of one true way. I think different organizations look at it differently. But what's your view on this?
Well, going back to being a CIO and then moving over to the CISO world, I do think that there are a lot of similarities between the roles. People, process, and tech are really our three focus areas. And in security, people, process, and tech is just a hair different, but not that much from what the CIO is doing. Overall, industries really don't know how to use the CISO role. 20 years ago, the CIO was in the same place. Organizations just didn't know how to use them. And then finally, it was decided that the CIO would be used not necessarily as a business person, even though we all think that we are, and we are, truly are. But they became, really the ones that were responsible for internal applications. I think and believe, knowing it full well, that the CISO is in the same space right now. Organizations don't know what to do. The scope of the job is so vast. The breadth and depth of experiences is so wide. And companies are like, well, do I need a pen tester? Do I need someone who can talk to the board of directors? Do I need someone who can just focus on the cloud? Is it physical security? Is it customer fraud? I mean, the opportunities are endless. And then you have certifications that various organizations have, either regulatory or some other framework. So where the CISO reports is definitely a topic of conversation. Personally, I don't like to see them reporting into the CTO or the CIO. And no, nothing bad about those roles, but those roles typically are there. They have their own gaps within their own shops. And if the CISO is handcuffed in any way or made silent around what the gaps are in an environment, we don't want to fight a political battle. What we want to do is identify exposures, our role, and then help to plug them up. So we all want to report to the CEO and the board. And personally, I think that we should be, because that's our voice. And the board and the CEO, personally, I believe that they need to have more skin in the game, and they need to have a better understanding of security. It's not just an expectation. It is, customers expect us to be able to protect their data. And companies have this expectation that everything is just all fine and good, but it takes a lot of work to protect an organization. So in some cases, I'm seeing the CISO is now reporting to legal. That's not a bad avenue. I mean, legal typically doesn't have the technology expertise, but they don't need that necessarily. If we're reporting into general counsel, it's a hand-in-hand relationship. We have to have strong relationships with general counsel, no matter what, based on their ability to understand, litigation and, legal laws and regulations, and for disclosure. So we do work hand in hand with legal. I see that as a stepping stone. And eventually I would like to see us closer to the board and the CEO. And in, more mature organizations, the CISO does report to that level, to the CEO and the board, and should. And even if they don't today, they absolutely should have access to the board at least on a monthly basis, worst case quarterly, depending on how frequently they meet. But someone should be asking the questions. And it's not about metrics around alerts and false positives. It's around, how are we doing? How are we protecting data? And what are the problems that we're having?
It makes a lot of sense. And I think, well, I don't think it's fully baked yet, but I think there's an expectation, and I'm not sure if it's coming from SEC, that there will be a requirement for organizations of at least certain size to have this expertise at the board level. So there'll be someone with understanding of the issues that the CISO is dealing with, so they can ask insightful and informed questions. So I think the trend is definitely going in that direction anyway. So making sure that CISOs do report do have the open communication channels with the board, and do report to kind of a senior enough level makes a lot of sense. I want to kind of switch tacks a little bit and ask for your opinion. Cybersecurity, if there are a couple of things that I learned about cybersecurity, one is that it's a team sport, and it certainly helps professionals, executive practitioners to connect, learn the best practices. But the other thing I also learned is that it's a moving target. Technology changes, vectors of attack change, things that are top of mind one day or 1 year or not the following year. And so it's always something captures everyone's attention. And I think these days, one of them, and obviously I don't want to limit the conversation to that, but ChatGPT is kind of top of mind for a lot of people. And we're already seeing kind of headlines that it could be used for, drafting phishing emails with perfect English, where before you could tell like the grammar is off, maybe it's coming from places less than friendly. So there are certain tells, but we see that just about anything can be used for good, but just as well for evil. What are your thoughts on ChatGPT specifically, but in general? What some of the things in the cybersecurity landscape, what some of the threats that you're seeing are emerging and are kind of becoming more important that our members and CISO practitioners in general should be at least paying some attention to?
I think that's a really great and loaded question. So I love technology, right? We can all use technology for our advantage. It helps us in our day-to-day lives. It helps us to defend against attackers. ChatGPT, will it be used, as another weapon of terror attack, against us from a cyber perspective? Probably, but, not like anything else, including email, right? I mean, anything is up for grabs right now. I think the one thing that you said that rings the most true is that the landscape is ever changing. So just when you think, and CISOs don't think this way, by the way, but a lot of board members do, just when you think you've eradicated the last issue, whatever that issue may be, you can sit back on your laurels and think, oh, I'm good for the day, right? You're not good for the day. If anyone understood what a security operations group goes through on a day-to-day basis, fielding thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of alerts and trying to verify what's true and what isn't. It's not for the faint of heart. And you have to have real, again, process, people, tech in order to understand and identify those threats. I think I know the threats are getting worse. They're getting more vicious. They're getting malicious. There is no stopping of what's happening out in the industry. And, even though our governments are putting policies and strategies in place, it doesn't stop the bad actors from doing what they want to do, which is criminalize their intentions, their operations to make money, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. So regulation doesn't necessarily help, but it does help when it comes to, one nation going after another nation and saying, we're going to put sanctions in place to stop some of it, but it never stops. We as CISOs and security professionals need to be diligent every single day. It's hard to imagine what the next threat is going to be because there's so many threat actors out there. There's so many nation states. There's so many groups that want to create the next bit of havoc. And what you need to do is have a solid program internally that helps to identify and defend against these bad actors. The best thing that we can do as security professionals is not just monitoring and detection, but also making sure that we have continuous improvement in our programs. So, what is good this year may not be good enough next year, and you need to constantly be monitoring and making sure that you're shoring up those gaps. One thing that a lot of organizations don't like, depends on who you are, the audit, right? Either internal or external. Yes, it's arduous. Yes, it's lengthy, and it can be really hard work to identify all of that evidence that you need. But at the end of the day, those audits are there to help you in understanding and detecting gaps in your security program. So I say embrace your internal auditor, or just your auditor in general. They're there to help you.
Absolutely. It makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting that what you mentioned is like the state-sponsored actors, and they call them APTs, Advanced Persistent Threat groups. It's interesting because I think in the media, and you see all this content, and you see, teenagers in hoodies in front of a computer. And I recently had a conversation with a member of Afinia who used to be in the government, and those days are long gone. Obviously, they're out there looking for trouble, but more often than not, CISOs are not up against, rogue groups, out of Eastern Europe, in their 20s, looking for mischief and looking for make quick money. It's really very well resourced, state-sponsored, state-of-the-art technology. Essentially it's an enterprise. It's an enterprise with division of labor, with processes, with vacation days, and with career growth. It's an enterprise-sized organization against another enterprise-sized organization that's extremely persistent and extremely well resourced. And I think it's still, maybe because of media, it hasn't sunk in yet, which kind of leads me to the next question. Right now, I mean, as I'm sure we're facing a little bit of headwinds from the economic standpoint. Layoffs. It seems like every other day there's another announcement that a tech company or a non-tech major company is announcing layoffs, which to me would mean that CISOs will be asked to do more with less, whether it's resource, whether it's less budget, fewer people in terms of the headcount, which creates a bit of a conundrum. The level of threats remains the same, but we're asked to do more. What are your thoughts on what's kind of a good framework you would suggest we use to approach something like this, where you need to retain the same kind of service level in terms of protection, in terms of making sure you're not an easy target, making sure that you're not a low-hanging fruit for an attacker with often less resources to rely on.
Let me try to break that down into several things. I'm going to go back to the beginning, what you're talking about, so many different individuals in these APT groups. The problem with these groups is that they're well-funded. They're making a ton of money. The large organizations, there's only probably a handful of individuals that really and truly know what's going on. But they're set up, a lot of them are set up as actual businesses, and they hire people, right? And everyone has a job. But what not everyone has is knowledge as to what they're actually doing. It's really at the highest levels that these attacks are being carried out. So, they may hire a whole bunch, I'm making this up on the fly, but they may hire a whole bunch of college grads to do research, right? Which college grads would be happy to do, or a whole bunch of software developers to create X module, right? Which they would be happy to do. And then the higher up that you go through this pod, this web, the attack comes together. And so, that's why it's really difficult to understand. It does take a village, right? But in the case of a APT group, you'd like to think that if more individuals knew what was going on, that someone would speak up. But again, they may not know what's going on. And this is even these cells, right? This is even how terrorist attacks happen, right? The head understands what's going on, and then they have their captains or their sergeants, their lieutenants, and then down into the organization it goes. And only a few people really and truly know what's going on and keeps the attack going. Same thing in the cyber world, it doesn't change. We as security professionals, yes, in this economic condition, a lot of us are being faced with doing more with less. I get a call every week from another CISO who's left their role or has been laid off. And it's really a little disconcerting out there right now because, again, the expectation is that our companies are safe, our customer data is safe, our employee data is safe, and yet security teams are being impacted in this, I'm not going to call it a recession, but this economic downturn. And, it just goes to show that there's a gap between organizations, the heads of organizations, and what's really, going on at the ground floor. CISOs they have a hard job, and they need to make sure that they have an effective roadmap in place. And look, when you're faced with doing more with less, you're going to have to pick and choose as to what's the most important thing. And I usually counsel individuals and say, look, it's not always the most severe thing that you should be tackling. If that one, initiative is going to take you, again, 6 months, a year, whatever, you may be able to make some inroads over time. But let's say you have the capacity to only do 2 things. You may want to focus in on doing something of a lower severity that kind of levels the playing field and brings it up to a higher level. You don't always have to focus in on the most highest severity item. And so CISOs have to make that determination as to what's going to give them, sort of the biggest bang for the buck. And help them to continue to improve their environment and continue to move the needle forward. Again, standardized controls are the way that we secure our environments. Whatever control that you use, and there's multiple frameworks out there, if it's the SOC or PCI or ISO or, NIST standards, whatever, CSI, whatever you use, just make sure that you're implementing the controls in a solid way, and that you're continuously improving on those controls over time. And that's, I don't want to say that's basically what you do, but it's one way to approach the issue.
Certainly. And kind of to double click on that, I think it's doing more with less comes with one, increased stress levels, because the expectation is going to kind of maintain the same level of protection, but with less resources. So naturally, more work kind of drops on fewer people. But also, I think in addition to stress levels, there's also there needs to be like a very clear understanding in terms of in delineation of there are never guarantees. We all talk about probabilities, and we all talk about prioritizing what's, to your point, what's the severity of this attack versus that attack. And I think it's very important, especially in the light of some of the recent events, how CISOs approach, seriously or not seriously, their personal liability. And I'm probably you have some certain thoughts on that. Like, what would you recommend CISOs do to make sure that, well, they still stay sane in their job, but also they're protected personally?
That's a great question. So I think that the first thing is that CISOs have to go in with a strategy. You know, your first 90 days on the job, you'd better be creating a strategy for the organization based on a gap assessment. You know, from there, you're going to create your roadmap, and, you know, over time, stay true to your roadmap, no matter how you end up prioritizing it, or in some cases right now, deprioritize it. But you have to keep the needle moving forward. That is first and foremost. I've had this conversation with privacy attorneys and just regular attorneys in my network, because, you know, what's happening out there right now is CISOs are leaving their roles due to personal liability. And it's not necessarily perceived liability, it is true liability. Some organizations don't necessarily conduct themselves the way that we would want them to conduct themselves. And so you need to make sure that you're part of the insurance, you know, errors and omissions. And there's actually been discussion in many groups about CISOs having retained counsel, not counsel that general counsel and our legal departments use, but having our own retained counsel so that we have someone to go to in the event that we feel that our companies are not conducting themselves ethically. And then we would have a voice for us, you know, if needed. So personal liability is a big thing in the industry right now. It's important that CISOs conduct themselves ethically at all times. And, you know, the bottom line is, if you're doing all the right things and you're communicating about your program and about gaps, which is called risk management, and that should be going all the way up, you know, to the CEO. Sometimes you have to separate yourself in the event that, you know, you're just not getting any traction, or, you know, company doesn't necessarily care. And the CISO at the end of the day has to protect themselves.
Certainly. No, it makes a lot of sense. It's important kind of, I know that for a lot of people, their work identity is a big part of their whole identity, and it's important to have a clear vision and not be surprised in the end when events outside of their control kind of impact both of them. So it certainly makes a lot of sense. And I think just bringing awareness to this subject, and it's part of the reason why I really wanted to have this conversation, because I don't think many people are aware that when things go sideways, often the organization would be looking for someone to kind of to end up holding the bag. And I think, and that comes back to the notion that cybersecurity professionals, they fight in the dark, meaning very few people know what's really going on. And if the company is successful, then the CEO gets the credit, or chief revenue officer, chief marketing officer, they get like the pat on the shoulder, good job, not realizing that it's the CISO of that organization was a huge part of this effort, making sure that all the success was done without any setbacks. But the flip side of that, if there's an active breach, if the company's name is in the headlines and not in a good way, then all eyes are on the CISO, and I think it's unfair. And I think kind of bringing awareness to that issue and making sure that CISOs and cybersecurity professionals in general structure their communications the right way, and I guess be louder in terms of how they voice their contribution and their constraints and their reality. So just the rest of the organization, A, gives them credit, and B, kind of everyone understands that cybersecurity is not a job for the cybersecurity department; it's everyone's job. And I think just CISO being aware of that will go a long way. I know we're coming up on time. So as a last question, I just want to go back to something that you said in the very beginning, that you are one of the very few women in cybersecurity executive space. And I know yesterday we had International Women's Day and everyone was so happy and proud, but I think it's to pay respect and pay attention and be kind of vocal once a year. I think we're missing out on the remainder of the year to do the same. So from your perspective, what can we do better?
Well, women, I give women everywhere that have reached, the C-level a lot of credit. We've earned our stripes to get to this level. Look, security is not for the faint of heart, but it can be done correctly, and you can have a work-life balance. Now, with that said, if there's a breach, it's all hands on deck until the breach is over. It doesn't matter, where you come from, what you're trying to do, but we have to give women more opportunities to understand the roles that they can have within cyber. And it doesn't necessarily just need to be the CISO. There's so many paths in security that any individual can take, not just women. But we need to make sure that we're educating, we're communicating, we're mentoring, and giving opportunities for women to be a part of this wonderful, wonderful organization called security. And again, it's the education of, the board, and the ELT to understand that it's not just technology, and it's not just compliance, and it's not just risk. Those three things together make an effective security program. And if it's tilted in one way or the other, then an organization is missing the boat. And so some CISOs, you can't be an expert at everything. Some have, more of a propensity to be more skilled in one area or another, but it's our jobs to understand what we're bringing in through our strategy and our roadmap, and then bring in the right skilled talent to help us in executing that roadmap. So I'm all for women. I'm all for anyone to come into the security ranks, because there's so many openings and there's so many needs right now.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think it's, again, from my perspective, it's really need to start a little bit more downstream with mentoring programs and just opening up eyes of maybe some of the junior professionals of what's available, so that what opportunities lie ahead and what's required, so that at least with that awareness, they can make career choices that kind of steer them towards that path. But it's certainly, clearly, we're not doing a very good job right now, and we can do so much better. And again, whatever Fini can do to further the cause, if you have any ideas, we're kind of very, very interested in making this an important point on the agenda. Well, so I know we're coming up on time. Where can our listeners find you? What's the best way to connect?
Probably the best way is through LinkedIn. I'm an avid networker and encourage thoughtful conversation and feedback, so they can find me on LinkedIn. Happy to connect.
So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.